Hello and welcome to my presentation called All Secrets. Thank you, Ben, so much for letting me speak at NHAMCon. Also, I'm sending regards to our hosts, and let's get on with the presentation. It's called All Secrets, and I think every bug bounty hunter should be familiar with the Auth protocol because of how many misconfigurations are there and because they lead to account takeover, and it's just not wise to not be familiar with it. My name is Grzegorz Niedziela. I go by the nickname GregXSunday. I'm the author of Bug Bounty Reports Explained brand, and I'm also a bug bounty hunter myself. Let's start with all the basics. Usually it starts with the user clicking login with Gmail button, login with Facebook button, connect account, whatever. And what happens under the hood is the website we're testing sends the request, or the browser sends a request to the website we're testing, which redirects the user to the authorization server. There are very interesting parameters here, but pretty much the whole presentation is about how we can exploit these parameters. So for now, I will just ignore them. Then the second request is to the authorization server. Often it will be some big known website like Gmail or Facebook, but it can also be like an internal authorization server. For example, you're testing app.com, but when you log in, it's actually identity app.com, login app.com, account app.com, whatever like this. And from user's perspective, it looks normally just like the login and password flow, but very often under the hood, it actually uses auth as well, and it can be equally vulnerable. And the impact is still an account takeover. So do not only think about the authorization server as those big websites. Then very likely the actual flow will contain a few requests on the right hand side here. Like the user will have to either choose the account or click authorize button or simply log in if they are logged out. But what we care about is after this flow, the user will be redirected back to the website we're testing with the very important parameter code, which is a one-time use parameter, which in the next step can be exchanged for the session cookie or whatever mechanism the target uses for authentication of the user. What happens in the backend, the website we're testing sends the request to the authorization server with the code to know what was the user that was logging in and stuff like this. But from our perspective, what's important is that this code is one-time use and it allows us to exchange the code for the session cookie. And in most cases, if we can leak the code, we can take over the account. Sometimes there are additional protections, but usually that's the case. And that's how this process looks on one slide. And as I've said, likely if that's the real target, there will be more requests, but it still comes down to these three. So one request that redirects the user to the authorization server, then the redirect back to the tested website, and then exchanging the code for the session cookie. These are sort of three requests that we will operate on. And the first parameter I'd like to cover is the state. And let's consider this attack scenario. As attackers, we start the login flow in our browser with our account, and then we are redirected back to the website we're testing with the code parameter. But we prevent our browser from consuming the code, and instead we send this URL to the victim, and then victim's browser sends the request to the target with the code, and they are logged into our account. So we have like an login CSRF. And you may say, login CSRF, it's not a great bug. It's not a great bug. It's often out of scope of bug bounty programs. And you would be right, but it is a low or a medium. If you can just log into victim to your account, it is not a great bug. But it's not only, the Auth protocol is not only for logging in. It can also be used for example, adding integrations. Imagine you have the medical website, which you can integrate with Google Calendar, and then your medical appointments are automatically synced to your Google Calendar. If you could have the login CSRF with integration with Google Calendar, and you can log in the victim account to your Google Calendar, and all of a sudden you see victims' medical appointments in your calendar, that's a serious bug. Also, sometimes you can connect accounts. So if the victim normally logs in with login and password and they are currently logged into the website, but you will all CSRF them to your Gmail account, then those accounts get merged, and all of a sudden you can log into victim's account with your Gmail. And in this case, it's also not a low and definitely a serious bugs. So the first attack that we have is the login CSRF, and the prevention for this is the state parameter, which can be set in the first step. It can be a cookie or a local storage or whatever. Then authorization server also gets the state, but it usually just forwards it back to the redirect URI, to the callback URI. And then in this step, the authorization server will check if the state sent here in the third step is the same as state that was set in the first step. And if we try to do the attack as we did before, we would just send to the victim this request, the second request of the flow. So we could not predict the state. So this attack will not work. The good thing is that the state is not a required parameter, and many flows just do not use it, which makes the login CSRF possible. And the bigger question is if we actually have a serious impact. Let's now continue to the parameter, which is pretty much the key for most of attacks, the redirect URI. Because in the second request to the authorization server, there is the redirect URI parameter, which contains the URL to which the authorization server redirects the user with the code. And in the early days of auth, you could just do something like this, just use the attacker server here, and the victim would be redirected to the attacker server, and the attacker would just have the code. And as you already know, the attacker usually can exchange the code for the session token and can just take over the victim's account. This, unfortunately, will probably not work in today's web. Usually the redirect URI is validated against a whitelist, and you have to do something more. Very likely you have to simply find an open redirect there or something like this that will allow you to leak the code. And I'll speak a lot about open redirects during this talk, and on most of my slides there will be the most basic like open redirect payload, but here are just a few payloads that I think will work in the majority of open redirects. This is like Pareto 20-80 principle of open redirect payloads. The first one, the simplest, is just concatenating the target website to attacker's website. It will work with the most basic validation of starts with of or index of. Then you have the fake relative payloads, where the website thinks that any URL that starts with a slash is a relative URL, so the open redirect can't happen. But when there are two slashes, it's not a relative URL, it's an absolute URL. So it also works in many cases. Then we have different characters before the @ sign. So if you're not familiar, if you have the @ sign in the URL, if there is no backslash here, this would be the host and this would be the user. But the backslash here confuses a lot of parsers. It comes down also to the difference between the WordWeb URL standard and the RFC, but let's not get into this now. But this payload is very, very useful and works often. Recently, I've heard about this payload working with the question mark before the @ sign. I think it's worth to just brute force anything before the @ sign, all the special characters, because it is clearly problematic for different parsers. And another payload that works sometimes is the new line payload. So these two, that's encoded new line sequence. And it works if the host is checked against a regular expression, which has the multi-line flag in. So it will match the next line of the URL, even though the actual host is here. And I think these payloads will cover most of open redirect scenarios. So we know how to exploit the most basic redirect, URI open redirect, but to be honest, you will probably not find it very easily in these days. More likely, you have to do something like this. So here we have the redirect URI that is checked, but it's only checked that it's on the correct host and the protocol, but you can control the path and parameters. This is not compliant with the RFC, but it is often the case. And what you can do then is you can send the victim to a URL like this, and then the authorization server will see, okay, the redirect is to the trusted website. It is to the website that was authorized, so it shouldn't be a problem. But then the tested website, sees this address, and because there is a open redirect here, instead of consuming the code, this endpoint just redirects the user. So it redirects the user to the attacker's website, then attacker gets the code, and as you already know, it leads to an account takeover. What's important is this redirect has to preserve parameters, which is not always the case, but we'll deal with this problem later. So we have 3 attacks already. We can also exploit the open redirect if we can manipulate the path of the redirect URI and if the redirect preserves parameters. We'll get back to the redirect URI later, but now let's take a look at another parameter which is often overlooked because it's not seen in many flows, because the prompt parameter will often not be present in this URL, but it will default to a value of consent, which means the user, even if they are logged in, will be shown this screen right here, and then they have to click a button for the outflow to continue. Another possible value of this attribute is select account. If you log in with Gmail sometimes, you have to choose the account to which you want to log in. It can also have the value of login, prompt login, and then the user has to input their username and password. And this is really bad for our attack, because it's pretty much as the phishing if we need the victim to fill in the username and password. But if you use the value of prompt none, then if the victim is logged in already, there will be no prompt. The victim will be redirected straight back to the website we're testing, which of course minimizes the redirection and increases the risk of the attack, increases the likelihood of the attack. Sometimes there are additional protections, but there are ways to still get through them. So now we don't add a new attack to our list, but we know that for all the redirect URI related attacks, we added a prompt none to minimize the user interaction. The next parameter which can be used to chain with other attacks is the response mode. On all the slides so far, I used the response mode query. It is the default value as well, so it can also be absent in the URL, but the default value will be query. And it means that the code in the redirect URI is present in the query after the question mark in the URL, as well as other parameters. Another possible value for the response mode is fragment. And then the redirect URI is very similar, but the difference is that now the code and the state are in the fragment. And it may seem like a very small difference, but it's actually very, very significant, because the callback endpoint to which you're redirected expects the code to be in the query. So if you send it in fragment, it likely will just not consume it. And we've seen it exploited, for example, in Reddit, where Franz Rosen would change this parameter, and then the code would be just present in the URL, unconsumed, which is very important. And then you need another bug to leak the URL, which is not easy to get, but here it was really great bug with I think Google Analytics XSS. We also have seen a similar attack on Facebook with exploiting the sandbox URL, which had access to the URL. So in general, if you can somehow make the code be unconsumed and be present in the URL, which, to be honest, most of providers will allow this to happen. If you then chain it with a vulnerability that leaks the URL, you can take over the account. So this is the next attack that we add to the list. Unfortunately, leaking the URL is usually the more difficult part. And also we can use the fragment to the attack I've shown before. I've said then that in the redirect URI here in the middle, we need this redirect to preserve parameters, which will not always be the case. But if you change the fragment, the response mode to fragment, the victim's code will be present in the fragment here. So it will not even be present in this redirect, but it will still stay in the browser. The browser will not drop the fragment, even if it's a cross-domain redirect. So then you can leak the code the same way as before. Just the difference is that we no longer need this redirect to be parameter preserving. We can just exploit it even without it, exploiting the fact that the browser will preserve the fragment during the redirect. There's also a value of forum post of the response mode, and the difference then is that instead of the redirect, the response contains a post which sends actually very similar request, just is the post, not the get. And from the user's perspective, there's also JS that automatically submits this form, so it knows like the user has to click something. And it is generally not useful for leaking the code, because it's very unlikely we will have a way to leak the body of the post request. But I've used it recently because I had XSS on the authorization server. It was like the internal authorization server. And I wanted to show the impact. I wanted to take over victim's account. But so what I did was I wrote this fetch request to initiate the authentication flow, or maybe not initiate, it's the second request of the authentication flow. But the code was only present in the location header, which I could not read. This code here, it does not work. So what I've done was I changed the response mode to form post, and then because I could read the response body, I could also read the code from the body, and I could leak the code this way. So it's also a way to show the clear impact of an XSS on the authorization server. There's also a value of web message for the response mode, and then it sends a post message to the opener. It can be used for the silent authentication without opening new tabs. And it sounds really sketchy, and I want to test it, but most targets I've tested either do not support it or I didn't find a way to exploit it, but it definitely sounds like something that has bugs in it. And it gets really fun when you start to chain these things together. On another target, I had the open redirect, but only in the post authentication state. So the redirect would only happen after successful authentication. And it was actually the post authentication redirect was present in the state parameter. Generally, any data in state parameter is the indicator that we should look further into this. So I was like, even if I redirect the victim after the authentication flow, the code has already been used, so it's useless to me. So what I did was I changed the response mode to fragment, and in the redirect URI, I embedded my code from my from my account to the target website. So the authorization server would redirect the victim into this URL with my code in the query with the state that redirects to my website. And then the authorization server, because I used response mode fragment, would add victim's code and other parameters in the fragment. So then the victim would be successfully logged into my account because there was my code. And then the victim post authentication would be redirected to my account, and the code would survive the redirect. It would still be present in the fragment. So I had the way to leak victims' code. So that's our last attack, exploiting the post authentication open redirect chained with login CSRF. Thank you so much. I hope you've learned something new from this presentation. You should definitely always test auth because it has great impact and it is often misconfigured. So it really pays off to know this protocol. Under these URLs, you can access slides from this presentation, and also you can fill in the survey. I will appreciate any feedback on the presentation. For now, once again, thank you for listening, and I hope you're enjoying the HamCon.